Oh, we're live. Lol. Hi everyone. Welcome back to the second live show in the. I was about to say all about Austin read along, but that was the last read along. But the inspiration for this one, which is the A to Z of classics, Let's Get Classical read along, where we're taking ourselves all the way from A to Z in the form of classical books. So welcome back. This time we are on B, which is in fact the second letter in the alphabet, and being two Yorkshire gals.
I really feel like right now I'm, when you go on holiday and an airplane, like the voice is directing things.
And you're the air hostess. But yeah, we are from Yorkshire, and I really felt like there was only one possible way we could go with picking a book for B, and that was to Big Up The Brontes. And so we decided to pick a book from who I'm going to describe as the lesser known, or rather lesser celebrated Bronte, and that is of course
the only one that's not in the GCSE
syllabus.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like, we hear a lot about Charlotte as the key Bronte. We hear a lot about Emily because Wuthering Heights is obviously a very, very popular, or rather a very divisive book, but we don't hear much about Anne. And so we decided to read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall.
Can you see my cover?
You got it right up.
Okay.
So we decided to read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. Predominantly for the reason, as I mentioned, we wanted to give a bit more of a spotlight to Anne Bronte and see what her work is all about, but also we have both read one book from Charlotte and one book from Emily, but we've not read anything by Anne, so it seemed like a great opportunity to continue celebrating the local legends that are the Bronte sisters, but also an opportunity to read something new. So thank you so much for joining us. This is what we're going to be discussing. I hope if you managed to read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, you're excited to discuss it with us as well. But I think in the meantime, as we wait for everyone to get settled in, it might be nice to just discuss our thoughts on the Bronte books in general before we dive into this one specifically. So, as I mentioned, we've both read one book by each of the other Bronte sisters. So do you want to talk about what you've read?
Okay, so I have read Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights.
The classics.
The only ones that are really prominent. But Wuthering Heights really did enjoy. Jane Eyre, I feel like at the time I did enjoy. I think Jane Eyre is a good entry into classics that's a bit more, I don't know if you'd classify it as gothic, but kind of the darker element of classics. But as I've gotten older and like reading this, I just feel like Jane Eyre is quite
simplistic.
Yeah, I feel like it's very, I'm not disputing its goodness. I think it's still a good classic, still a really good book to read. Like the story about madness and everything is really, really important.
Yeah.
And done really, really well. But I feel like because it's so chronological, it's just very, it's kind of a bit there. There isn't really that kind of level of complexity that I think Wuthering Heights provides.
I feel like Jane Eyre, again, I've also read Jane Eyre and I did really enjoy it when I read it, but I do think of the three books, it's definitely the more predictable.
Yeah.
Where again, I've had this discussion when discussing Pride and Prejudice as well. It's so hard to know with these super well-known classics whether or not the predictability is a result of the actual text and the way it's written, or how in popular culture they are. Like Pride and Prejudice, you know what's going on, you know the names of Lizzie and Darcy, and you just kind of have a rough idea of what to expect. And I think the same goes for Jane Eyre, and you just know a rough bit about it. You certainly know the name Mr. Rochester, regardless of what role he plays. I feel like there are certain expectations you have from these really popular books, and so I find it really hard to disentangle how predictable they are from reality, because it's so hard to know how predictable you would have found it reading as a reader when it was originally published versus now, as we already know so much about them. So I do feel like Jane Eyre does come across slightly more predictable than The Tenant of Wildfell Hall or Wuthering Heights, but it is still a really interesting text, and I think it has its interesting elements, and it is nice to be able to follow a character, I think, right from childhood through to like adulthood and establishing themselves out in the world. So I think that is one of the strengths of Jane Eyre. And also being that it is like a very, I don't want to say it's an entry level classic, but it is for a lot of people like a go-to first classic because of how well known it is. And I think maybe the chronological sort of like timeline and that like ability to follow a character's full arc right from being young to obviously adulthood, like I mentioned, does make it like an attractive prospect for someone who's newer to classics. So I can see the appeal and I did enjoy it. However, I definitely preferred Wuthering Heights.
Yeah, I think it's one of those that it's a bit different in the sense that you're not introduced to about 5,000 characters on page 2 and it is quite simple to follow. I don't want to overuse the word simple here, but it is one of the easier ones to follow. And I think because it has the chronological aspect, you kind of know where you're going with it. Whereas Wuthering Heights, to a certain extent, both characters, like they're called Catherine and Cathay, and it can get a bit confusing. And I think with like even Austen, like obviously not so much Pride and Prejudice, but I can't remember which one it was now, whether Persuasion or Northanger, where there's so many characters introduced in the beginning, and you're just like, who belongs to who?
I think definitely it's Northanger Abbey where it's like there are lots and lots of people just like thrown in right at the beginning. But I do think that is definitely indicative of books of this era. Like they did just have a lot of characters, and whereas now an author would never dream of writing a book with 2 characters with the same name unless there was a specific reason for it. And generally speaking, authors like to be really creative with names and throw out some really wacky ones that you probably never see on a real human. I feel like authors of this era, like they had a much more slim pool of names to choose from. There was no such thing as like TikTok accounts that were all about like cool, aesthetic, whimsical baby names, which I love watching those videos because it's so fun to see what's out there. But that just didn't exist then. So I do think it's very difficult to
and names run in the family as well.
Yeah, I feel like it can be easy to get lost amongst all of the characters who have very similar names, and sometimes even the exact same name, which is a bit confusing. But yeah, I do agree.
And they're always known as Mr. and Mrs. and Miss by their surname. So when you've got
I think there must be a reason for that, because in Emma by Jane Austen, we have Mr. Knightley, who's obviously like the primary romantic interest, and we also have Mr. John Knightley, who's his younger brother. And so we also have Miss Bennet and then Miss Elizabeth Bennet, and obviously like so on and so forth with the Bennet family. So I feel like there is definitely a logic there, which would have been far more apparent. Like you would have been much more used to it if you were around at that time, because you would know, okay, the person who we're calling Mr. whatever his name is like the head of the family, and then the ones below that obviously are of a lower standing. But as a modern reader, where those kinds of like naming customs just don't really have the same level of significance, it can be a little bit daunting to like approach and get used to it. However, what I will say is that later on in the A to Z of classics, we have a Russian classic. So we have Anna Karenina is definitely on there, and I think we're also doing another Russian classic somewhere in there, possibly. Can't quite remember. We may be the Master and Margarita right behind me. We're mastering the Margarita. So
we are, aren't we?
What I will say is that the English classics, while they do have people of certain names that feel very like you got a lot of repetition, and there are lots of like Henrys and Johns and all that kind of stuff, and it's like, God, how many more people can you have called Henry or John? However, oh yes, and we're reading one by Boris Pasternak, which is Dr. Zhivago, and that one has a lot of characters, I'm telling you.
My God, we're gonna have a pronunciation. I'm gonna try.
But what I think is very interesting and makes I'm trying to remind myself that the English classics are really easy to digest in this sense, is that in Russian classics we have a lot of characters, a lot of names that sound fairly similar, but then each of those individual characters goes by about 5 or 6 different like nicknames and things like that. So, oh yeah, hi John, sorry, did not mean to insult your name there. But it does come up quite a lot in the classics. But yeah, so like in War and Peace, we'll have like Natasha Rostov, and then she'll also be like more simple ones like Natasha and then Tasha, but then she'd also go by like Natalia and other kinds of ones. And there are names that are not obvious nicknames in to us in England because it's not like it doesn't make sense. Like I'm trying to think what's an example like Alexander. I think has like a nickname that begins with M, and I can't remember what it is.
Like William, you've also got Bill.
So it's like if you were a native in that language, you would like be like, oh yeah, of course, Robert, that could be Bob. But when you're reading a book where there's so many characters and a language that you're like less familiar with and naming and nicknaming customs that you're not as familiar with, it's a lot to take in. But I'm still excited about it. I feel like we've gone on such a tangent of names, but yeah. Wuthering Heights. Let's talk about that briefly, and then we will be diving into the Tenant of Wildfell Hall. So I really liked Wuthering Heights, and I know that it is a very, very, very divisive book because of the fact that people, I suppose it gets like titled as like a romance of sorts, and people feel very, very passionate one way or the other about whether or not it should be considered a romance. And I feel like it's a whole discussion in and of itself is that conversation, so we won't dive into that now. But I know that people generally seem to either love or hate Wuthering Heights. I really liked it because I do just think it was very mysterious. It wasn't a linear timeline, so there were lots of like backs and forths and multiple different insights into what was going on, and it was very gothic, and I really liked it.
I'd say it's probably one of the more cleverly written classics that I think you read at a younger age, like as a teenager. I think that one really, it kind of, I don't know the right phrase, but it kind of spins the idea of classics on its head, really. If you read that one, like compared to Jane Eyre, compared to all the Jane Austen books and everything, it kind of just adds a different dimension to it because it's not Frankenstein and Dracula.
I think it has, I suppose, like more of a connection to Frankenstein in the narrative style and the sense that you're like hearing a story told through people that weren't directly there, like with someone who's like roughly connected to the narrative but wasn't directly involved. And there are these like elusive characters who are seen as like really bad and all really good, and you kind of have like this divisive nature of like how the characters are explored and presented. And then there are also like brief elements where you think that there could be something paranormal going on, and so I feel like it's definitely got a similar style to Frankenstein, or you could see that they maybe took inspiration from like similar areas in the way that the books were written. But I do think, yeah, like a lot of classics of the era, though thoroughly enjoyable, they generally did tend to stick to quite a linear timeline with either just an omniscient narrator who's giving you the story like as it is and telling you everything that's going on, or like one protagonist and you're just following them through their journey. So I feel like Wuthering Heights definitely has a bit more of like a complicated and mysterious narrative style, which I really liked. And I feel like that leads us very nicely onto the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which is why we are all, in fact, here. So this book, I think, definitely falls more towards the Wuthering Heights end of the Bronte spectrum versus Jane Eyre, and I think that comes down to the narrative style. So I don't know whether now might be a nice time to share our ratings and or rankings of the three books so that we can get an idea of where each of the three books, obviously we haven't read all of the Bronte's books, but we've now read one from each sister, so I feel like ranking them might be fun. What do you reckon? Do you want to go
I
first?
don't think Emily Bronte wrote anything. She wrote
poetry, yeah, so she only wrote one novel.
That was only a novel. But yes, okay. Am I going first?
Should we both start with our least favourite?
Okay. Number 3.
Yeah. Do you want to do a 3, 2, 1?
We'll do a 3, 2, 1.
Okay. 3, 2, 1. Jane Eyre. Okay.
It's not, I feel like I've presented it as I really hate this book. I don't, I think it's really interesting. I really, really like the idea of the mad woman in the attic and unlawful confinement. Like, I wrote about it in my dissertation, but I just think compared to the other two, the other two have a lot more complexity that I personally like in books. I really like the timeline changes during a novel. I don't really like things in chronological order, but that's just me.
Yeah.
But Jane Eyre's not a bad book. I just feel like I've kind of...
No, I mean, it's fair. It's one of those situations, I think, where we're rating 3 books that are all good.
Yeah.
So it's like none of them are like a
Would
bad
I read
book.
them again? Yes, I would.
Yes, and I'm actually keen to read Jane Eyre again because it's been a few years since I've read it, to be honest.
I want to reread Wuthering Heights.
Yeah, maybe in 2 years after we finish this read along.
Let's not start another one after that.
No, we'll just read them separately.
Let's just leave this.
Okay, next up then we have our second favourite, so sitting in middle spot. We'll go again. 3, 2, 1.
Wuthering Heights. I was like,
I got really my second favourite is The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, but I started seeing you make the W sound, and I was about to say Wuthering Heights when that was not what I meant.
I was next to my mind. I was like, right, Tenant of Wildfell Hall, because I was like, Wildfell Hall, Wuthering Heights.
Yeah.
Got to distinguish between.
Okay, so then we're reversed then. So that puts my favourite as Wuthering Heights and your favourite as The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. Interesting. And I know you don't really rate books, but if you were told right now you've got to rate a book, what would you give it?
Out of 5, I'd give it like a 3.9.
Oh, okay.
Like,
so
almost verging on 4.
But it's not
I just think, did this need to be 524 pages? No, it did not. Just like Alias Grace.
Bit too long.
Yeah.
Okay. So for me, officially on Goodreads, I've rated it 3 stars, but I would probably rate it 3.5. And when you're thinking of giving a 0.5 star rating, it's always the question, isn't it, of whether to go for the one that's slightly higher or the one that's slightly lower. But in this instance, I'm giving it 3.5, but I rated it 3 on Goodreads because I do think there were a few flaws in the narrative, and just like, I think maybe it's because I've just read it, but I think I'd be more keen to reread Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre than this one, although I do think this was categorically a better novel than Jane Eyre. I also just don't know if the rereadability desire is there for me right now, so that's why I've given it 3/3.5. However, I do think it was an interesting book, and there were lots of good elements about it.
Oh, definitely. I really, really liked the structure. Well, no. I really liked the structure of Volume 1. Then you had Volume 2. I kind of think Volume 3 was a bit wishy-washy.
I also think the division between the volumes and where it chose to switch from Volume 1 to 2 was a bit random.
Yeah, it can. I get what was trying to happen, and I think Volume 2 was excellent. I'm not going to dispute Volume 2. Volume 2 was great, but just between them, I feel like maybe because she didn't really know how to distinguish between the volumes, because obviously between Volume 1 you've got Gilbert writing letters. Who the bloody hell he's writing these letters to? Because frankly, I mean, obviously I know you know, but I would not care if somebody sent me this in letter form. I'd just be like, no thank you. And then obviously going into the diaries, I think is really interesting. But again, I just agree. I feel like the change didn't really make any sense. And I think the way it was done, it was kind of like they needed to just go into the diary entries. And so she had him just suddenly have the diaries.
Yeah.
And then Volume 3, I was a bit confused. And then it had letters thrown in. Why everything in a classical book must be written in a letter?
There is, in classical books, I think something of, they don't ever leave anything to the imagination. They're like, if I've thought it as the author, I must write this down and give them every bit of detail that I possibly can, just in case. So I feel like there is a lot of like letter writing, and it's, I suppose, like, again, in modern terms, it might be considered like clumsy writing in the sense of like, it's not basic as such, but it's like okay, I need to convey this information between two characters who are not in the same place geographically, so I must, like, the only way is to write a letter. So there was no like...
Yeah, I think it was interesting because this novel is essentially a letter, or groups of letters rather, one would hope. But so it's just kind of like, it just feels letters upon letters. Don't get me wrong, some of them really interesting. Really liked the last two. But it was just a bit like another letter. And I feel because Alias Grace obviously had letters, Persuasion had letters, didn't it? And Northanger Abbey.
Yeah, and Frankenstein, we've not obviously read yet, we're going to be reading later, but Frankenstein is entirely in the form of like letter.
What's the word for that? Epistolary.
Epistolary, yeah, epistolary. So yeah, it is. But I feel like there are certain books, E.G. Frankenstein, where you're like, okay, that's a story you'd want to convey. You're traveling as a ship captain in like Russia and the surrounding area, and you just got this incredible story that's been told to you. You can't believe what's happened. You better write home and tell your sister. But this, it's like, it's interesting virtually, like, not in the sense like it wasn't interesting to read as readers, but in the sense of like, if you were like an acquaintance of this guy, it's kind of one of those things that's only really interesting to the person who's involved.
Why would you? The diary entries for me of this book, the diary entries of Helen, were the best bit of the novel. Why would you enclose this woman's diary entries to this man? Why would you do that? You wouldn't really.
No, especially because like the respect between those two characters was so high. And like the friendship that they formed was like really intense, and I feel like it was a friendship founded on mutual respect. So I feel like knowing that she had confided something that she was like really struggling to express to the outer world to him, I doubt that Gilbert would have then just been like, yeah, I'm going to like just print copies of your diary and send them out to the rest of the world. Like, it just wouldn't have happened.
Because if volume 1 had ended with him signing off the letter and then starting another letter again, then I feel like that I could kind of understand. But as it's one whole collective, it doesn't seem to really make a whole lot of sense.
No.
And I feel maybe this novel would be better without the start where it says to, I can't remember who wrote the letter to, but without that bit, and then without the end where he signs it off, yours.
Yeah. Because like it
Gilbert.
Could have totally just been a
chapter. It should have started at chapter 1. Like, I don't think it really needed the introduction. Letter, the introductory letter.
No. And also like it was slightly inconsistent in the sense that like it started off with like letters that were very letter length, and then are you to assume that he's like still continuing the story in letter format, but like they become much longer and it's not really told in the same style. So there's definitely some confusion there. I must admit, looking back on it, I think that the structure was well intentioned. However, it was definitely a roller coaster of interest for me. Like, I actually started out this book really struggling to get invested in the characters. I think the book written from Gilbert's perspective as he's writing this letter to whoever he's writing to, it felt very, very over-explanatory. So like it just felt like you were being given so many details. And again, going back to that like a simplistic writing style where like the author has to like feed you everything, and it's definitely a case of telling rather than showing, and like it just feels as if you are being given so many details. And obviously this will be indicative of like how people spoke then, but there are just so many roundabout ways of saying a sentence that it just feels as though you are being bogged down by so much detail. which I think has its place. And obviously there are times when you really need to get a lot of information, but also I think at the very beginning of a novel, there's a really fine balance between getting you invested in the characters and giving you the information. And I think this book skewed too far in the sense of information overload without really giving you much to care about from the characters. And I think I'm grateful that I did continue reading it because it definitely gripped me more later on. However, I do wonder if I wasn't reading this one for the book club and I didn't have to finish it, whether or not the beginning would have put me off, because I definitely wasn't motivated to read it in the first volume.
I agree. It took me 5 days to get to page 50. Like it really,
Yeah.
It was a push. And I thought the beginning bit didn't align with what I thought the book was on. So I went on Wikipedia.
Yeah.
And I searched, I was looking on Wikipedia to see if it picked up. And I saw how it said volume 2 was the diaries. And I thought, right, okay, that's what I want to read about, because that's, I mean, even from the blurb, that's what it is about the woman, you know. So I think that's what really pushed me to do that. So I think if we weren't doing it for this, I would still have tried to push forward. However, would I have really kept up with volume 3? No, I probably would have ditched it after
volume 2.
Yeah.
That's interesting, because I feel like after I'd made it past volume 2, I was definitely invested enough to want to follow it to the end. But volume 1 was definitely an uphill battle, in my opinion. I think the very end of volume 1, you started to get this back and forth between Gilbert and Mrs. Graham as we knew her at the beginning of the book, and there's definitely an element of mystery being sort of like built around this character, and I think probably very reasonably so. She's like a very elusive character, so at the beginning I think it's very hard to empathize with her, and I think you definitely feel a sense of what the other people in the village feel about her, which is like a feeling of mistrust or of being like snubbed, and as if she thinks that she's better than all of them, which obviously we very much come to learn isn't the case as we know her like story and everything. But at the beginning, I don't really care too much for Gilbert. I feel like he doesn't really, you don't learn a huge amount about him as a character. He's just kind of like a vessel for telling the story.
He's
in my
also
opinion,
not very nice at certain points.
No,
like,
he's like
Eliza.
He's very like, I guess, like extreme sometimes with his emotions, and we see that with how he treats Helen's brother. Obviously, who he doesn't know is her brother, but there's like a whole load of drama there.
God, yes.
But yeah, it's, you know, I think a very difficult book to get invested in the characters at the beginning. Like, I really do feel like there is a sense of, I don't see much to appreciate in either of the two main characters at the beginning. But as you get towards the end of volume 1, I started to feel a bit more of a connection with them both and was invested in like finding out the mystery of Helen and her backstory and where she came from. And of course, then that means that you're like super hooked and ready to go into volume 2, where you start to get this information. So this is quite interesting because we have here that someone loved the beginning and the end, but the middle, which is obviously in volume 2 of Helen's husband just going away for months and her not knowing when he was going to come back, felt like it went on forever. And I think that's a very fair point, because I think that had a very interesting element and was obviously integral to the story, and like understanding her relationship, her marriage, and how she came to feel like she had to leave. But I do feel like it was quite repetitive, and you know, the same situation could have been achieved by exploring the fact that that happened like once or twice and not having to go over and over again and then have the same situations of him bringing his friends back to the house and causing mayhem and her being disappointed and gradually caring less and less each time and wanting to put less of her own time into trying to change him. So I feel like it has its use and obviously is important to the text, but I think it was just another example of like this same thing could have been achieved in way less words.
Yeah, I do think there were certain points, and I feel like in volume 3 especially, it was kind of like there were like recaps of what we've already read, and the book isn't long enough to demand a recap.
No.
and very few books should demand a recap, really.
Yeah.
And I just thought it was kind of like, I've only just read this, I know, let's move forward. And I think that's why I didn't give it 4 stars. I think if somebody had edited it, I'm not saying nobody didn't edit it, but
not the same as if the book was edited now, is it?
Yeah, and I think this book did not need to be 524 pages.
No, I think a lot of what brought the book down for me was just that case of like, when you explain the book, you obviously only pick out the key details of the plot, and when you describe the key details of the plot, it's an interesting novel, and there are lots of interesting parts and mysteries built up around the characters and how their relationships kind of intertwine, and like it's quite a dark and twisted story, which is obviously like not super common for the era, I guess, or maybe the experience was common in terms of women having to suffer at the hands of like drunk husbands and just basically being like trapped into a life where there was no escape. So I feel like maybe it was a relatable story for people at the time, but also it was probably like a bit risque to kind of like put that out there and to like say it so bluntly and to explore the inequalities faced by women at this time. So I feel like when you take back all of the excess detail and just describe the plot, super interesting book. However, it's not the way it is it? Like, you know, there are all of those extra details, and I feel like that is what brings down the rating for me.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, because this book is kind of known as, Anne Bronte is kind of like proto-feminist. I think that's the right phrase. And I think it really does a good job to emphasize like the power of women and feminism before the concept came about. Like there were so many certain quotes in the book that I thought, wow, you know, this really like shows. I highlighted one actually. Yeah, and I thought, you know what, this really shows how clever Anne Bronte is. Like there's a whole paragraph.
Oh wow.
Here that I highlighted. But it's when Helen's talking about women with the neighbours and the Markhams and stuff, and then she's like, a woman either has to be so vicious or feeble-minded that when in terms of temptation, like either you want a woman to not completely go against the norms, but then you want a woman to also kind of be bold enough, but only in terms of being a woman. And I thought they were really, really modern ideas. And I thought they were so interesting. And you can see why that it wasn't, well, it's not that it wasn't permitted to be published. It's the fact that Charlotte, whoops, didn't allow it to be published after Anne's death, really, because she didn't deem it appropriate, which I think is quite interesting considering it's her own sister. I mean, you could argue sisterly jealousy.
Yeah. But it does speak to how like bold the book was in like the statements it was making about females and their roles in society at the time and the patriarchy and what that meant for women. And I feel like it made some really, really excellent points. And 100% this is like a great example of like an early feminist text because it's so explicit. I feel like probably that's the one place where the over explanation and like very frank and like to the point descriptions are like in its favor, is that there's no doubt about this being like a feminist text. Like it's so obvious in the way that it describes women and just makes some very, very clear points about the institute of marriage at this time. So I feel like that is super interesting. And I really, really enjoyed seeing that unfold. I feel like I definitely marked a couple of chapters, although I'm not as smart as you and I didn't actually highlight anything. But I think I folded that same page as you about about vice and virtue.
I think also actually what's interesting is that when she's documenting the abuse and neglect by her husband, at no point do we get the inclination, if that's the right word, that it is Helen's fault.
No.
Like at no point is that ever the insinuation by anybody in the text, really. And then, but if you compare that with Jane Eyre, you know, Mr. Rochester and Jane Eyre to a certain extent does vilify the madwoman in the attic.
Yeah.
You know, is, so I can't remember what her name,
Bertha, yeah.
is suggested to be her fault, and obviously she's supposed to be the villain, but really women aren't, to a certain extent, vilified, I think, in the same way in this text, which I think is quite interesting.
This text explores the vilification of women, I think, and also like explores the inequalities that are faced, but from a very sympathetic point of view to women, and to a point of view that makes the men look like idiots and brutes and, you know, like very, very unlikable characters who are going to end up in hell according to the text. So I feel like
it's quite religious.
It's very interesting to kind of like see that it explores the realities of the situation. It's not like a utopian feminist text that kind of like explores like a better world. It's like a very dark one that explores all of the bad things that happen, but in a way that's very pro-female. And I got a quote that's a bit less like, so it's interesting that we have like a dark example in the story of Helen and like her experience in a sort of like domestic violence kind of toxic relationship. We also have families that are like much happier, like Gilbert's own family, which is the quote that I'm just about to read. But even in that, you see this like inequality between the value of men and the value of women, and just like little things that women are expected to do. So we have here where Rose is kind of talking about how her mum only cares about Fergus and Gilbert and how they are the ones who are like the most important, and she comes second as a sister. So she'll say, Rose, don't put too many spices in the pudding. Gilbert likes it plain. Or mind you put plenty of currants in the cake. Fergus likes plenty. And if I say, well, Mama, I don't, I'm taught to not think of myself. You know, Rose, in all household matters, we have only two things to consider. First, what's proper to be done, and secondly, what's most agreeable to the gentlemen of the house. Anything will do for the ladies. And so I think that speaks to the text, whereas like even in like a simple domestic situation such as Gilbert's family, or in a far more dark and sort of like serious situation such as Helen's, there is this expectation that men will do what men want to do no matter what it is, and that women simply have to do one thing, and that is just to enable the men to do whatever they want to do. And like that's the expectation, that women kind of just act as facilitators for like men's happiness basically, and like their own opinions don't matter at all. It's all just about doing what it is that the men want. And I think it's interesting that we get to see that in both like an innocent domestic situation and in that more serious one, because it just kind of shows how it's so ingrained, and it's not just these men who are evil who are the perpetrators of the problem. It's also, you know, every man and every woman also who's kind of like perpetuating this patriarchal like society. So it's really interesting to see that from both perspectives, I think.
I think that's a really good point, actually, the fact that it was so ingrained, that it was also not encouraged by women, but also kind of expected by them at the same time. Like women, obviously, like most mothers love their children anyway, like daughters or sons, but how the mothers kind of expected, you know, the sons to have what they wanted, like that was achieved.
It's obviously like such a different society. It's so hard to like fathom, because, you know, at this point in time, the men were out working and women were like at home and homemakers. And so there was not only an inequality in like the opinion and the value of, you know, the two sexes, but there was also, I guess, an inequality in work share. So like perhaps there was just this view that men do more work and therefore deserve more reward. But obviously that was just through the fact that women weren't allowed to work. And so there are like so many societal things that are like ingrained to kind of cement the way that this patriarchal society functioned. But I think it's very easy now to look at, like, if we were to see a woman who was being oppressed and you see that as like a free woman, you would think that's so sad, like she's living such a sheltered life and she's not able to do what she wants to do. She's just having to live for her husband and with his permission, basically. And like we can see that now as a terrible thing. At this time, that was just like there was no other option. So it wasn't even as if women would like be considering really, like they might be jealous of men, but also like there was no example of an alternative available to them. So I feel like that's like an interesting dynamic as well, because like Anne obviously can recognize the fact that she doesn't agree with this, but also she's not really able to present an alternative because it just wasn't possible at that time.
Yeah. I think one thing as well that was quite interesting in the book was Helen's husband, Arthur. When they also have their child, also called Arthur, Arthur, the
Senior.
husband, Arthur Senior, hated Arthur Junior.
Yeah.
Like to the point where that I think surprised me initially, because you know in those days a son was wanted to carry on the family name, to carry on, you know, just the jobs, the house, the money would be passed down through the male side of the family. But Arthur Senior kind of seemed to hate the son because he was taking away the attention from Helen.
Well, it was also a really good example of like his personality, which was obviously like very self-indulgent and very like hedonistic.
Yeah.
So he only cared about things that could give him like pleasure and gratification. And he says at a certain point, like Helen is trying to make him kiss the baby or something, and he basically says like, I don't love the baby because it is just like a lump of nothingness. Like it doesn't give me anything.
Maybe I like it when it's
and so
older or something.
Yeah, he's like very much, and he also says this later in a discussion about religion where Helen is trying to encourage him to repent before it's too late and he dies and ends up in hell. And he basically says like, how can I repent to something that's just an idea? Like I can't accept anything that I can't like physically gratify myself with. And so we see that with the baby. He doesn't care about it or love it because it doesn't give anything back to him at that point, and he becomes more interested in the child as it grows up. But I think his personality is just such that he only cares for things that can give him something in return.
That again must have been quite a forward thing to say. Obviously you can tell that he's in the novel he is the kind of enemy, the villain, but still, even for a villain to say that at the time, that's quite, and also to give quite a frank reason for not believing either, that's quite an interesting.
I think because the main character in Helen was very like guided by religion, and like it presented her as virtuous and an empathetic character, and him as a character who was to be like deplored. It was like allowable, I suppose, because it was like, oh, of course he would say something like that because he is like a sinner, basically. Whereas to see someone like Helen trying to like do good and still care and love for someone who has treated her so badly, I feel like that probably is why they were allowed to throw in the bit of religious questioning, because it didn't come from a character who we were supposed to like. But it's very, very interesting. I feel like the main takeaway that I've got from this book is that, first of all, very forward thinking. Second of all, when you talk about it and explore all of the key elements, there is so much to dig into in terms of the exploration of feminism, of domestic violence, of the institution of marriage in general, and of like the limitations put on women in society to be able to like act independently. There's just so much to take from it. However, I think when you are in the reading experience, it's hard to appreciate that because all of those interesting things are kind of buried amongst a lot of like excess detail.
I completely agree.
That would be my key takeaway, I reckon. Obviously, if anyone has any questions or anything super specific that you want us to discuss, do let us know in the chat. Do you have anything else you wanted to add?
This is the first Bronte book out of the sisters that I've read that I actually have a keenness to read her other one. Like this is, I do own some poetry from Emily Bronte, and I own some others of Charlotte Bronte's work.
Yeah.
But I've never really had the urge. This makes me want to pick up Agnes Grey, which is about governesses and stuff, and compare it to Jane Eyre in the sense that both are governess, and I want to see that comparison there.
100%. Obviously, sounds as though there is a lot of extra detail in this one as well, which kind of puts me off a little bit.
It's a lot shorter though. That's what appeals. Yeah, that's definitely under 300 pages.
Nice. Well, that's good then. What are Charlotte's other books? I know she's got Villette.
Shirley,
yeah.
The Professor.
Oh, so quite a few. Yeah, I'm interested to read some of her other ones because, you know, Jane Eyre is the one that people talk about. So I'd be interested to see if any of her other ones are better.
I can't remember if it's Villette or Shirley. I'm sure another one is also about a governess.
Oh, right. They clearly had a type.
Yeah, they were governesses.
Yeah.
Governor. Maybe it was writing about what they know, which draws on to what we said about Jane Austen, about how she never actually married.
Wrote about marriage. Yeah, she wrote about courtship and society. I also think it comes back to what we were talking about with names right at the beginning, and that is that. Oh well, here we go. Literally, the names come up again and again in all of the works. The point I was going to make was that while, you know, it was restricted, like what people could know outside of their own like culture and society, because, you know, there was no internet, so people couldn't just research things, and like you couldn't find out cool new unique names from other places. You just had to go with what you knew and what you'd come across. And I think the same probably goes for their experiences and writing about things that were familiar to them, because they didn't have any other experiences to draw on, and they could only, I suppose, learn from like word of mouth, talking to people and reading other works.
Well, actually, because it says on the back of ours, it says using her own experiences, being Anne, with her brother Bramwell to depict the cruelty and debauchery from which Helen flees. So she's
drawing on her own
experiences with her brother in a different way. Because I suppose in Haworth, there's not exactly. I don't know if they went to London. I don't really know if that was.
I don't believe so, because they weren't super rich, were they?
No,
as a family. Like unlike Jane Austen, who was from like a much wealthier background. And I think it's interesting, you know, like for example, obviously Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein, she drew on something that was like an unknown, which was obviously the paranormal and the idea of bringing a creature to life from nothing. But she also wrote about travel and experiences going across Europe and different settings and countries, and making journeys back and forth and all of that kind of thing. And we know that she wrote Frankenstein whilst on a trip with other, you know, like poets and authors in, I think, Switzerland it was that they were in. So, or it might have been, I think it was Switzerland. It's either Switzerland or Germany, but either way, we know
it was raining.
Yes, it was indeed raining. But it's interesting, like, yeah, that's like a much more adventurous novel, but she was a woman who had the opportunity to experience a much more, I guess, like rugged journey across society, like which a lot of women at that time would not have had the opportunity to do. So I feel like it's definitely a common theme in these classics that we see people drawing on elements of the experiences that they can relate to and have seen play out in their own lives, because that is, you know, largely what they would have had access to. Because while imagination is a great thing, there's a limit to imagination, that it can only kind of like be built around things that you have like somewhat interacted with, and like your imagination kind of like builds on those experiences. See, that's interesting. So they did get the chance to travel, but I do think that obviously, like in terms of setting, especially for Wuthering Heights, like that draws a lot on the like nature and area of Yorkshire.
On,
so yeah,
Top Withens in Haworth, which is a derelict, abandoned house. There's sheep wander through now.
Cute, love a bit of sheep. But yeah, so I think that probably draws the Tenant of Wildfell Hall to a close, and I'm really glad to now have read a book by each of the three Bronte sisters. Now, a little bit of an update with regards to the next couple of months of the read along. So May, which is C, is going to be reading Charles Dickens's Hard Times. However, we're actually going to be combining the live shows for May and June because Sarah and I have a fair bit of travel between the two of us.
We're very busy. We're very busy people, and I cannot read Hard Times in less than 3 weeks.
No, so we have my birthday coming up, you're going on holiday, then you're going to see Anna.
Could be going to see Celine Dion, but she's
cancelled. And then I'm going away for a while. So basically, all that to say, we're not going to have time at the end of May to fit in this live show. So we're going to be combining C and...
Wait, shall I do the C?
C and...
do the C.
D. D. D.
Just do that. Wait, that'll B.
Yeah.
You know what? Forget it.
We're going to be combining C, Charles Dickens's Hard Times, and also D, which is The House on the Strand by Daphne du Maurier, and reading both of those books over the next 2 months, and then we'll have a big bonanza live show on the final weekend of June, which falls across the 25th and 26th of June, and we will of course give more details closer to the time. But I am thinking that we'll probably host some live reading sprints at some point in May and June. So you've not seen the back of us. We will catch up with you and share some brief thoughts on Hard Times at some point in May, but the official live show will be in June along with D for Daphne du Maurier. So all that to say, thank you so much for joining us for the second Let's Get Classical live show. I hope you have enjoyed, and we will see you in the next one. Bye.
Bye.